Well, hello class. In this particular session, we are going to be talking about ethics and social responsibility. Now, I'm only going to cover the first half of chapter 3, so I kind of want you to pay a little bit of attention to what I'm going to cover in this chapter and ask you to consider the following learning outcomes in the chapter. So when we talk about ethics and social responsibility, there's an awful lot of material to discuss. So let's look at some of the takeaways here. And that is, number one, what is ethical behavior? Number two, how do ethical dilemmas complicate the workplace? And I will cover 3 and 4 next week, which is how can ethical standards be maintained and what are social responsibility and corporate governance. So let's look at the first thing and look at some of the outcomes of the first two takeaways here. Number one is defining ethics. Well, what is ethics? Ethical behavior and social responsibility, or corporate social responsibility, are critical issues for a lot of contemporary managers. The chapter seeks to make you understand and become aware of various ethical dilemmas that you might face in your career while encouraging you to adopt high ethical standards. It also examines the role of social responsibility and governance in contemporary issues. So this chapter is going to begin by defining some of the key terms such as ethics and ethical behavior before considering these terms in a managerial context. So we're going to be looking at the utilitarian view, individualism view, moral rights, and justice views of ethical behavior. We're going to have some opposing viewpoints on the relationships between culture and ethics and the notion of universal ethical values, okay, for guiding the operations of multinational companies. So let's look at the first one. And the first takeaway question, as I said, was what is ethical behavior? What are some of the laws and values that are determinants of ethical behavior? Look at some alternative views of ethics and cultural issues in ethical behavior. So, here again, let's look at the first thing. What is ethics? Ethics can be defined as the code of moral principles that set standards of good or bad, right or wrong in one's conduct, and thereby guides the behavior of a person or group. On the other hand, ethical behavior is behavior that is accepted as good and right as opposed to bad or wrong in the context of the governing moral code. So, when we look at the laws and values of determinants of ethical behavior, we would say that anything legal is not necessarily ethical, since there may be different cultures with competing ethical frameworks within the same country, or even legislation that lags behind changes in moral positions within a society. What one considers ethical varies according to personal values. Like, what do I consider to be ethical? The underlying beliefs and attitudes that help determine individual behavior. So there are types of values that influence ethical judgments. Obviously, if the behavior is ethical or not ethical, they are related to certain judgments. So there are two things that we look at: terminal values, and they are preferences about desired end states, and instrumental values that are preferred regarding the means for accomplishing desired ends. So if you look at your book, Figure 3-1 on page 59 of your text, it's going to illustrate the four views of ethical behavior. There's going to be the utilitarian view, the individualism view, the moral rights view, and the justice view. Okay, now the justice view is going to look at ethical behavior which is somewhat impartial and fair in treating people according to legal rules and standards. Now remember what we said, ethical does not necessarily mean legal. So we have different types of justice. They are procedural, distributive, interactional, and commutative. 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 Now, all of these ethical views have drawbacks. There's the utilitarian view, which relies on the assessment of future outcomes that are difficult to predict and measure accurately. The individualism view, which presumes that individuals should be self-regulating. The moral rights view, which provides for individual rights but does not ensure that the outcome that's associated with protecting those rights are necessarily beneficial to the majority of society. And there's the I can't say it, the commutative view. Stop laughing at me, I see you doing that. And that is placing an emphasis on fairness and equity, but this viewpoint raises the question of which type of justice is going to be paramount. So we're going to be looking at these types of things, and we're going to be looking at some critical issues in ethical behavior, and that is cultural relativism and moral absolutism. And critics claim moral absolutism is a form of ethical imperialism. I know a lot of stuff, but we'll get through it. Or the attempt to impose one ethical standards on others. Now, if you look in your book on Figure 3-2 on page 62 of your, you're going to be able to see contrast between cultural relativism and moral absolutism. Okay? Thomas Donaldson argues that instead that certain fundamental rights and ethical standards are considered to be hypernorms. They should transcend cultural boundaries. Now, even with the commitment to persons' core values, there's an underlying transcultural ethical umbrella. International business behaviors. We're going to talk a lot about global management ethics, because what's one ethical standard for one country may not be for another. And they can be tailored to local and regional cultural contexts. In other words, some countries may believe in child labor. So, anyway, that's kind of an overview of where we're going to be coming on for. Now, you're giving your presentations this Wednesday, so this will not be a discussion until a week from this coming Monday when we have class. This coming Monday, we're going to be finishing up Chapter 2. I said that was an important chapter because we're going through all the theorists, remember? So we're not going to be talking about this until the 26th of September. Okay, so look and reading, listening, and viewing for video specifics on this stuff that I just talked about.